The LLI was founded in 2013 with an intense focus on developing and cultivating leaders that would tackle some of the countries and the world's most difficult problems. And that's exactly what we do here this morning. We began our work as a fellowship taking extraordinary individuals and getting them ready for executive service. But what's happened over the course of our work here at the University of Denver is we realized to have real, meaningful, lasting change, not only in our communities, but in the communities where we come from, that we were going to have to step a little bit further into the work. So now we conduct research and convene stakeholders through symposiums like we are this morning. What's at stake here is not only individuals living on the island today, but it is all of those that have left the island after the hurricane. It is about their livelihood, it is about the future of Puerto Rico, and here in Colorado we have a growing, burgeoning population of Puerto Ricans. Across the country in 2016, in fact, we had 3.4 million Puerto Ricos living on the island, but 5.4 million living in the continental U.S. Experts predict that in the coming years, this population in Puerto Rico will dip, in large part because of the hurricane. And that means that here in the United States, in the continental United States, we'll see the populations grow. After the hurricane, federal data from post office address requests and FEMA filings demonstrated that thousands of Puerto Ricans are relocating to all corners of the United States, including Florida, New York, Hawaii, Alaska, and here in Colorado. The Latino Leadership Institute realizes that not only convening and talking here today, but we also must put money and resources, time, talent, and treasure to solving the problems that Puerto Ricans are facing. So we make a plug for Casa Pueblo, an NGO doing that important relief work in Puerto Rico today. It is an honor to be able to introduce to you Dr. Aaron Schneider. Aaron Schneider is Associate Professor in the Josef Korbel School of International Studies. He also serves as the Director of Latin American Center. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Aaron Schneider this morning.
I want to welcome you all to this series of Puerto Rico Solidarity events. As Joel indicated, I'm Aaron Schneider. I'm the Director of the Latin America Center. And I want to say a few quick words about our headliner, although we'll have a full introduction in a second by Roberto Corrada. And I want to talk about our agenda for the rest of the day and also say a few words about connecting Puerto Rico to more general questions of governmental neglect, elite attacks on working classes and people of color, and struggles for alternative paths of development. To give you some background, when the hurricane hit Puerto Rico, I looked at my colleagues and we said we had to do something. I came here 4 years ago from New Orleans, where I was for 6 years, and I had seen what kind of political and economic and social devastation first a hurricane can produce, and then the efforts of elite factions who captured the city government and used it to rebuild the city for themselves while ignoring the rest of the people that lived there. I've written that story as well as the way that working people in popular sectors resist in a recently published book, Renew Orleans, Globalized Development and Working Class Resistance After Katrina. And I want to talk a little bit about that. Before I do want to say how pleased we are at the Latin America Center to have Juan Gonzalez here. When we were coming up with names for who we should invite around the Puerto Rico Solidarity event, his name was at the top of the list. For more than 40 years, Juan Gonzalez has been one of the best known Latino journalists, activists, public intellectuals. He's co-host every day of Democracy Now!, which appears on KGNU here and other outlets at 8 a.m. He just does it well, and he does it right every single day, and he's a real hero as far as this kind of solidarity and organizing and journalism goes. For some of my students and younger folks who are out here, if you want to know how you get your start on this kind of an illustrious career, he was a leader in the Young Lords, a radical militant civil rights organization of Puerto Ricans in the 1960s, and he's been organizing ever since. Today we are going to have Juan Gonzalez present over breakfast and several other invitees, and we made it a priority to invite people from Puerto Rico to Denver. And so we'll have Professor Jacqueline Font Guzman, Luis Ponce, Raymond Laureano, Ortiz, and Raymond, I should mention, is our Puerto Rico postdoc solidarity. Another aspect of the solidarity that we wanted to show with Puerto Rico was to create a space for scholars who maybe need some time and infrastructure and support to come and write and do the work that they need to do that might be hard to do in Puerto Rico if they don't have that stable tenure track job that is really nice to have. After that panel, we'll have Annette Martinez, Jimmy Torres, and Juan Padrón. There's food in the back, and we should feel free to stand up and grab food and drink as you go. There are bathrooms through there and through there in the back left, and we'll take care of that later. In the back right, and feel free to get up and walk around as you wish. Those tables in the back where you can stand up are sometimes nice to stretch out. We'll break for about 10 minutes between each panel, so there will be time for those breaks, but certainly make yourselves comfortable as you're here. I told you that I wanted to connect Puerto Rico to larger issues of governmental neglect and elite attacks on working classes and people of color. This is the book that I just wrote. There we go. Renew Orleans, and in this book I look at how this process unfolded in New Orleans, and I wanted to talk about it because I see it as a cautionary tale for Puerto Rico, but I also see it as there are glimmers of hope and episodes of success of popular movements in social movements in New Orleans, and so I do want to call those out and draw attention to those. You've heard the story, a hurricane kills a large number of people, destroys infrastructure, local authority is too divided among rival elite factions to respond, the federal government willfully neglects a semi-colonial territory, and national and international capital moves in to redevelop the area in ways that will make them more money, but ignores working class people of color who live there. I could be talking about Puerto Rico. I am talking about New Orleans after Katrina. I published this book just a few weeks ago, and the book describes the way in which Hurricane Katrina punctuated and accelerated the gentrification, the deindustrialization, the elite capture that's happening in cities all across the country. New Orleans is unique, and Puerto Rico is unique, but this pattern that we see in New Orleans is true of Puerto Rico and of many municipalities all across the country, and the kinds of resistance that we see in New Orleans, episodic, only occasionally successful, but it outlines an alternative kind of development for the city of New Orleans and perhaps for Puerto Rico and other cities facing these challenges. The cover of the book, you'll notice, has the New Orleans skyline in the background, and you can kind of barely make out the Superdome and those sort of images that everyone knows. In the foreground is a shuttered shipyard. The Avondale shipyard used to employ 17,000 people in good, middle-class, unionized jobs, charting someone from a high school education through to a career of employment, decent salary and training. After Katrina, the owners of the shipyard transferred their assets, including the insurance money that they got from Katrina, to other shipyards, and transferred debt to Avondale, and ended up closing the shipyard. The people that worked at Avondale were good people. I did surveys and work with the metal workers union there, and 67% of them had rebuilt their own homes, and 55% of them had helped their neighbors rebuild their homes. These are the people that are lost when you shut a shipyard like this, a source of good jobs. The point is that policy and government were captured by a faction of local capital that had no interest in sectors where they had to share power with workers. How did this faction of capital capture power, you might ask? They captured control of the billions of dollars that were channeled into New Orleans after the hurricane, and they used that money, setting themselves up as the mediators of national and international capital operating in New Orleans in the reconstruction of the city. And as mediators, they then were able to capture local power. And they did it electorally, and you can see an increasing cleavage electorally between upper class and lower class. And they did it in non-electoral means. They captured all the non-governmental, quasi-governmental committees, boards, special districts, public benefit corporations, where they could control the sectors that they cared about, which were primarily the reconstruction and tourism and services, and they could organize policy in a way that deregulated, and specifically deregulated so they could increase profits by assigning people to jobs on the basis of ascriptive characteristics. If you were a white male, you had a shot at some of the few good jobs that operate in the restaurant sector, in the services and tourism sector. If you were a black female, if you were Latino, you did not. So this is a graph of the network of these commissions that operated in the tourism and the services and these specific privatizing entities. And they're all connected to each other. You can see how they share their board members and they share their legal teams. And so they're all connected to each other. And they form this quasi-government outside of the elected government, which they eventually were able to capture themselves. Just to say a few words about the kind of development that they promoted in tourism and services, it's booming. So New Orleans is, in fact, a growing and flourishing city. There is money being made in New Orleans, but it is being captured and controlled by this particular faction of capital. It's a huge part of the local economy. There are ways in which they have prioritized it in the local economy. They connect to national and international organizations. We call them, or people call them, sort of empires of restaurant firms, in which you have fine dining establishments that are connected and owned by single owners. And they push through their trade associations, the Louisiana Restaurant Association, the National Restaurant Association. They push a deregulated, high-profit, low-cost model. Here's a quote from their website. Our professional lobbyists fight for you and your rights to operate in a profitable manner with fewer restrictions. And they've segmented the sector in a way that there's only a few good jobs in fine dining in the front of the house where someone can get those tips from the $25 and $30 a plate meals, and everybody else in the back of the house has a sub-poverty wage. The allocation of people to these jobs, if you are a black female in New Orleans, you have you're 49% of the people in quick serve, in McDonald's and fast food are black women. If you are, and there's 21% are white male and 14% are white female. In the fine dining jobs, there's twice as many white men in the front of the house as there are any other group. So your likelihood of getting one of those few good jobs is determined by race, by gender, by ethnicity, but workers resist. Workers organize. And the group that I was working with in the restaurant sector, Restaurant Opportunity Center, they organized in New Orleans, they organized in New York to begin with, and many other cities, and they've been doing really great work. And they find allies that can contribute to the research that they're doing. They organize public policies to fight these strategies of development, and they engage in direct action in campaigns. And this was one particular campaign where Tony Moran's, this awful restaurant in the French Quarter, was bouncing checks, was stealing tips, was allocating the black workers to the second floor of the restaurant where there were fewer tables and lower tips and simply lower wages. And all sorts of other nonsense that the owners were doing. And the Restaurant Opportunity Centers joined with the Congreso de Jornaleros, the Congress of Day Laborers, construction workers, many of them undocumented, who were organizing in New Orleans also. And they realized that the mistreatment that workers were getting in restaurants, the stealing of tips, is just like the stealing of wages on construction sites that undocumented immigrants were facing. That the way in which people are brought to the US and stripped of their rights so that their labor can be exploited is something that is historic, that is age-old. This allowed the African-American majority of New Orleans to ally with the new incoming influx of Latino workers who recognized that 150 years ago, 200 years ago, they brought slaves here, stripped them of their rights so that they could steal their labor. Now they bring undocumented immigrants, bring them here, strip them of their rights, and steal their labor. So these ways of forming solidarity from workplace to workplace, from workplace to the home, fighting immigration, fighting racism, fighting the denial of public housing and services. These solidarities were the kinds of alternative development and struggles that were outlined in New Orleans. And they won rarely, they won only episodically, but these were important ways in which they described a development that wasn't deregulated, that wasn't high profit, low cost. A development that was inclusive for everybody, that did not segment on the basis of race and gender and ethnicity and citizenship. And so these alternatives are out there. They are happening on the ground. Casa Pueblo that Joel mentioned and that some of our colleagues have been working with in Puerto Rico is articulating this kind of grassroots, solidaristic development that is an alternative to what might be imposed. So I want to hand off to Roberto Corrada, who is going to introduce Juan Gonzalez. I do want to thank the folks who have been part of this effort today. It couldn't have happened without all of them. The DU Latino Center for Community Engagement and Scholarship, Dulces, the Center for Multicultural Excellence, the Graduate School of Social Work, SEIU, World Denver, the Latin America Center, the Latino Leadership Institute lent its important staff time and help, and that's in the form of Marco Dorado, who really has been a champion in this whole work. Luis Ponce and Roberto Corrada, who's about to come up, have coordinated all along. Raymond Laudiano Ortiz, our postdoc, has also been participating. Notice that there has not been a single prominent elite donor on that list of people who are helping out. All the events of today and yesterday are the result of progressive professors and staff at units across campus who carved money from their budgets to support Puerto Rico, along with the help of SEIU Labor Union. And I mention this because I asked. I approached the elite of Denver and asked them, can you help Puerto Rico out and help this Puerto Rico event? And working people understand what our bosses don't. When someone is hurting and under threat, you help. You show solidarity and you help. I express thanks to everybody here who's here for this event and who contributed to this event. I know that we've got a great roster of presenters. Roberto Corrado is a professor at Sturm Law School and is I've forgotten his official title, but he is the Mulligan Burleson Chair of Modern Learning. He is Puerto Rican. He's grown up, like many Puerto Ricans, between Puerto Rico and the mainland US. And he's a scholar of education and has come up with really innovative and interesting approaches to education that he began in law school, but really have been adopted across different disciplines and sectors. So anyway, Roberto, please come up so you can offer a quick introduction.
Thanks very much, Aaron. When I was invited to introduce our speaker for today, Juan Gonzalez, I was told I'd be introducing him. I didn't realize that Aaron would do a little mini introduction first. So, I'll be doing a little bit of a repeat introduction, but fortunately our speaker today is sufficiently distinguished that he can bear two introductions, I think. So, I met Juan Gonzalez for the first time 20 years ago when he came out and was the keynoter at the LatCrit 5 conference that was sponsored by DU but was held up in Breckenridge, Colorado. It's emblematic of the constant struggle or challenge in the relationship between the United States and Puerto Rico, that at that time, what we were talking about was the jailing of Puerto Ricans who were protesting the bombing of Vieques by the US Navy. And so the struggle continues. It seems like whenever we get together, there's always something new to talk about. And today we'll be talking about the hurricane. Juan Gonzalez is a progressive broadcast journalist and investigative reporter. He was a columnist for the New York Daily News for 29 years, but most of you, as Aaron has mentioned, may know him for co-hosting Democracy Now! With Amy Goodman. A graduate of Columbia College, Gonzalez was active in the anti-Vietnam War movement, was a member of Students for a Democratic Society, and a founding member of the New York City branch of the Young Lords. I wonder if Mr. Gonzalez is ever introduced without somebody mentioning the Young Lords. That seems to capture our imagination. Before the Daily News, he worked for the Philadelphia Daily News and the Village Voice. He's won many awards for his journalism and investigative reporting. Motivated by a sense about the unjust treatment of people, he has written 4 books: Fallout, The Environmental Consequences of the World Trade Center Collapse, Harvest of Empire, A History of Latinos in America, Roll Down Your Window, Stories of a Forgotten America, and his latest, Reclaiming Gotham, Bill de Blasio and the Movement to End America's Tale of Two Cities. Please join me in welcoming our speaker for today, Juan Gonzalez.
Thank you, and good morning to everyone. And to my thanks to Aaron Schneider and the Institute for putting on this program. I've spoken several colleges in recent, I guess in the last 2 years, on the crisis in Puerto Rico, especially since Hurricane Maria hit. But I confess this is the first time west of Mississippi that there's been a conference of this type that begins to look at the condition of Puerto Rico. So it's really inspiring and important that people in other parts of the country are saying, hey, we've got to do some serious analysis of what's going on the island of Puerto Rico and what the responsibility of those of us who live in the United States is. I've titled my my talk, let me see if I can get this up here. Okay, so Paradise Lost. Because for those of you who have been to Puerto Rico, you know that it really is close to paradise. I've been studying closely for nearly 50 years now, the relationship between Puerto Rico and the United States. As a journalist, as a researcher and chronicler of Latino history, as a longtime activist in the Puerto Rican community of the United States, one who devoted considerable time and sacrifice in my youth building some major groups like the Young Lords Party, the National Congress for Puerto Rican Rights, and the National Association of Hispanic Journalists. And as someone who was born on that incredibly beautiful Caribbean island, still has family there and cares deeply about what happens to my homeland. Puerto Rico is now beset by 3 simultaneous crises. One is decades of economic stagnation, which is a direct result of the structural problems of its colonial relationship with the United States. Another is a budgetary debt crisis that has been gathering steam for the past 10 years and which finally exploded in 2015. And the last was caused on September 20th by Hurricane Maria, right on the heels of Hurricane Irma. These 3 tragedies have now combined to create a humanitarian catastrophe unprecedented in the history of any jurisdiction under the American flag. The average American only became aware of any problems in Paradise in June of 2015, though Wall Street financial experts have known for years that the day of reckoning is coming. That was when the island's former governor, Alejandro Garcia Padilla, announced in a New York Times interview on June 29th that the annual debt service on more than $70 billion in bonds that Puerto Rico and its various authorities and cities had issued over the past few decades was, quote, no longer payable. He thus publicly acknowledged his government was on the verge of the largest debt default and bankruptcy in the history of American municipal bonds. Far bigger than what happened in Orange County decades ago or in Detroit more recently. By the way, the actual indebtedness of Puerto Rico dwarfs anything we've ever known. The government and its various public agencies currently owe between $73 and $74 billion, depends on how you count, to bondholders. It also owes another $49 billion to the retirement funds of the current and former government workers on unfunded pension liabilities, for a total indebtedness of north of $123 billion. This is several orders of magnitude greater than the $18 billion that Detroit owed when it went bankrupt several years ago and was then the biggest bankruptcy in American history. We're talking several orders of magnitude greater than the Detroit collapse. In the 2.5 years since Governor Padilla's announcement, Puerto Rico has received more attention in the US media and among Washington politicians than at any time in the island's modern history. The almost daily coverage has surpassed even the last media juggernaut nearly 2 decades ago, which was mentioned when all the massive civil disobedience protests forced the US Navy's bombing practice on the island of Vieques to come to an end. Unfortunately, it almost always takes a crisis to get the American public to focus its gaze on the plight of 3.4 million residents of Puerto Rico, to stop viewing the island simply through the same tired, stereotypical lens of either sun-drenched tourist destination or an economic dependency and welfare basket case. Amazingly, a national poll taken after Maria revealed that 46% of Americans were not even aware that Puerto Ricans are legally US citizens, which makes fashioning humane and just solutions to the island's current crisis even more difficult. This combination of public ignorance, arrogant neglect by Washington lawmakers toward Puerto Rico, not to mention the simplistic insistence by some on the island that resolving the status of Puerto Rico is the most pressing issue, all have been obstacles to coming up with a solution to meet the needs, everyday needs of the people. I believe we need to dig deep to analyze how US influence over Puerto Rico has evolved over the past 20 or 30 years, how changes in the world capitalist economy have been manifested in our homeland. It is time we acknowledge that globalization has rendered historic concepts of national independence almost meaningless. You no longer need foreign armies to control a population when you can read everyone's email, tap everyone's phone, empty a country's coffers, and paralyze its economy from afar through satellites, instant wire transfers, and simple cancellations of bank credit lines. We need more creative and flexible tactics to defend small nations from the bullying of larger nations, to assert national sovereignty in an increasingly interdependent world. Many of us are familiar by now with the heartbreaking scenes in the aftermath of Maria on September 20th. The flooding, the destruction of homes, the almost total electrical blackout of the island for the longest period of any region in modern American history. Of course, this is the infamous map of Puerto Rico before Maria and Puerto Rico after Maria in terms of the extent of the blackout, or not the map, the shot from space of Puerto Rico. And then there is the death toll. Not only the people killed immediately during the storm, but those who died in the weeks and months afterwards because essential health services and lack of basic supplies. At first, the report was 16. Later, it was increased to 64 officially. But the number is obviously now closer to 1,000, according to investigations by both the New York Times and Puerto Rico's own Center for Investigative Journalism, when it compared the numbers of dead in previous periods, parallel periods, to the number of dead that occurred immediately after the hurricane. As in most disasters, two critical phenomena occur. First, those with wealth and power seek to take advantage of the population by instituting what Naomi Klein has called the shock doctrine, pushing through radical privatization and of public institutions that would never have been tolerated in normal times. But those who are powerless and without great wealth are forced to work cooperatively and to organize with their neighbors and friends to save their homes and their communities. And in Puerto Rico, the spontaneous and heroic community grassroots efforts were truly extraordinary and continue to this day, especially in the face of the total ineptness of the central government, of FEMA, and the White House. But even before the hurricane hit, Puerto Rico was already the most troubled jurisdiction under the American flag. The economy has been in a death spiral since 2006. Others at this conference today will discuss the impact, the terrible impact of that decline on the Puerto Rican people. But most attention so far has centered on the total debt the central government, its various public corporations and municipal governments owe to Wall Street and the bondholders. That debt has nearly doubled just in the past 10 years, from about 40 billion to 74 billion. And as the island's financial crisis ballooned, government austerity efforts intensified, industry kept fleeing, jobs kept shrinking, and people kept leaving the island. This is the growing debt. This is the population trend. And of course, it's much worse since the hurricane, with another 200,000 or so people leaving after the hurricane, in the months after the hurricane. The sheer size of that debt and the lack of tools the island's leaders have to tackle it is why some have described Puerto Rico as America's Greece. Could the island's economic collapse and financial crisis threaten the larger American economy, of which it is an integral part? A view that I have been espousing now for more than 2 years. Most financial experts dismiss the notion, but then most discounted the possibility that the subprime mortgage crisis would spark a worldwide recession. Well, here's what Bond Buyer, the Bible of the municipal bond industry, said last month. And I'm quoting from Bond Buyer. Puerto Rico's debt crisis is taking a toll on the mainland municipal bond market. Municipal participants say the ripple effects from the biggest municipal bankruptcy ever have shaken investor confidence in lower rated states and cities, legal promises, and credit ratings in general. How did all of this get to this stage? Was it from the ineptness or corruption of Puerto Rican officials and the island's elite, as some in Congress have claimed? Or from the overly liberal social welfare programs devised during the period of the Muñoz Marin social democratic experiment? Or from the Puerto Rican population getting dependent for too long on federal assistance programs? I've been covering urban affairs in this country for 40 years as a journalist. I can assure you that there's no more corruption and ineptness on the island of Puerto Rico than there is right here in the United States. And that the post-war social democracy of Puerto Rico has already been largely dismantled by several waves of economic austerity. The heart of the crisis cannot be understood without grasping the structural problems created by Puerto Rico's continued status as a colony. Ever since the U.S. occupied and grabbed Puerto Rico in 1898 during the Spanish-American War, Washington and our big corporations have dictated the rules of the game for the island's inhabitants and used Puerto Rico as a source of unparalleled wealth. As historians of the island know, this was made possible by a series of U.S. Supreme Court decisions back in the early 1900s, known as the Insular cases, that gave legal cover to the United States' holding of an overseas colonial empire. In my view, there have been 3 phases of the colonial domination of Puerto Rico. First came the sugar barons, paying their workers starvation wages, rigging sugar prices for enormous profits, with the U.S. government directly ruling the island as a classic colony where the governors were appointed by the president. Americans were appointed to go and run and administer Puerto Rico. And that was the first phase until in the early 1950s, and after the World War II and the development of the United Nations and the anti-colonial struggle, the United States got somewhat embarrassed over the fact that it was still holding the classic colony. So it devised a new form of administering the colony, which was called the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico. And that signaled the move to the industrial phase of the Commonwealth and colonialism, which was marked by cheap labor, offshore manufacturing, development of the New Deal program, Operation Bootstrap, a mass migration of many unskilled Puerto Ricans to the United States to work in agriculture and the garment industries, the creation of the Estado Libre Asociado, and also some socially progressive labor policies in Puerto Rico, and of course the creation of Puerto Rico as a military bulwark, where as much as 13% of the entire land of Puerto Rico was occupied by U.S. military bases, including Roosevelt Roads, which for many years was the largest U.S. base in the world. But by the 1980s, Puerto Rico had become the most profitable entity in the world for the United States, at least until China, Bangladesh, and Vietnam started offering even cheaper labor. But then, between 1996 and 2006, Congress phased out the last federal tax loopholes for the island. Manufacturers increasingly fled. By then, with the Cold War over, Puerto Rico suddenly became the colony that Washington didn't need. All of the bases were closed, one by one. But Congress was stuck with the reality that it had imposed U.S. citizenship on the Puerto Ricans in 1917, a second-class citizenship, a citizenship to colonial subjects, but a citizenship nonetheless. By the early 21st century, the Commonwealth model was no longer viable, but it was kept on life support by what I call the Uber phase of colonialism, of direct Wall Street financing of the government's affairs. And that Uber phase was, as I said, dominated by the withdrawal of the bases, the peddling of massive debt to keep the government afloat, and more austerity programs and the sell-offs of whatever public enterprises could be sold off, the airports, the highways, the toll roads, whatever they could sell, they tried to sell to keep the economy afloat. This last phase culminated in 2015 with the passage by Congress of Promesa, 2016, and the installation of a control board to run the affairs of the island, using the old style of sending people from the United States to dictate policies. Instead of that old saying, back to the future, this was sprinting headlong into the past. Last month, the Promesa board once again rejected Governor Rosselló's financial plan, because any financial plan by the governor or the legislature has to be approved by Promesa, and directed him to change it, even though he'd already agreed to privatize the electric utility and start privatizing public education, to slash the funding for the University of Puerto Rico and other austerity programs. But he was refusing the board's demand that he cut the government pensions by 10%. This is the governor, the conservative governor of Puerto Rico, Ricky Rosselló, speaking. He said, quote, "The oversight board pretends to dictate the government's public policy. This is not only illegal, but is unacceptable. Because of this, I rescind the proposed labor reform, which includes a cut of vacation days, sick leave, and the elimination of the Christmas bonus," the governor tweeted. So the governor of the island is accusing the Promesa board of illegally dictating the affairs of the Puerto Rican people. But what about this debt? If Puerto Rico contracted this debt, should it be held responsible for it? Everyone must pay their debts after all. Well, not exactly. People fail to pay their debts all the time. Ask Donald Trump. They usually declare bankruptcy and start over. It even occurs to governments. Greece, Argentina, Mexico, and many other countries have had debt crises. Here at home, Orange County, Jefferson County, Alabama, Detroit, all have gone through bankruptcies. It's not routine, but it happens. In Puerto Rico's case, however, the island was in the financial limbo. Because it is not a sovereign nation, it cannot appeal to the IMF for a restructuring deal that usually involves a devaluation of a currency, because the currency is the US dollar. And because it is not a state, It does not have the power to pursue Chapter 9 bankruptcy procedures and force creditors to accept a lower payment on their debt. It was inexplicably banned from bankruptcy by an act of Congress in 1984. So bondholders always knew that Puerto Rico had no legal recourse to bankruptcy, and that its Constitution of the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico specifically guaranteed that the government would pay off its debts before any other expense, before paying teachers, before paying police. The first dibs on any revenue for the government of Puerto Rico, according to the Constitution of Puerto Rico, was bondholders. So the bondholders felt that their debt repayment was guaranteed. Puerto Rico was legally unable to go to bankruptcy. And that fed their willingness to lend money even when it was clear that the island could never pay back the debt it was incurring. And Wall Street kept devising more complex financial instruments to mask this fact, many of which are arguably illegal but have never been challenged in a court proceeding. My favorite example is a whole bunch of bonds that were called the COFINA bonds, the sales tax bonds in Puerto Rico. I think they're now like 15 billion, I forget the exact number, of the 74 billion total that are sales tax bonds that are guaranteed by the sales tax of Puerto Rico. That's why Puerto Rico is now paying 11.5% sales tax, because it's all going to pay bonds. So a whole bunch of these COFINA bonds were issued starting in 2006-07. I don't know how many of you have ever read bond documents. I've spent a lot of time over the years covering urban affairs and urban development, reading bond documents. Every bond document is like a book. If you study it, it tells an amazing story. Because when people are going to lend you several $100 million, they want to know that, one, you can pay it back, and two, exactly what the money's going to be used for, and how you're going to pay it back. And so they're amazingly detailed. So for instance, this is one bond document that was floated in 2007 by a COFINA bond by Puerto Rico. And you can see all the Wall Street firms at the bottom that were the underwriters of the bonds and sold the bonds. I think the total was $2.7 billion in bonds at about 5.25% interest, which those of you who know municipal bonds, that's kind of high, but Puerto Rico's debt rating, their credit rating was kind of low, so they had to pay higher interest rates. But when you study the various coupons in the bond, you realize the amazing theft of money that was going on. There was one bond in particular that I looked at. These bonds, you did not have to pay. The bonds were 47-year bonds, some of them were 42 years, but your average bond is 30 years. This was like into the 40s, mid-40s, high 40s, depending on the maturity date of the different coupons. And in one particular bond, which I always, here's an example of the maturity dates on some of these bonds. Remember, this is issued in 2007. And the thing about the bonds, before I show you that one, is that you didn't have to pay the principal on the bond for 47 years. So in one case, Puerto Rico borrows $97 million in one coupon. And the bondholders tell them for 47 years, you don't have to pay us any principal. Now, you know, some people do that. They do a balloon mortgage in the house, you know, where they pay a big portion of the principal at the end. That's known as a financial instrument. But this bond, which is called a capital appreciation bond, CAB, that's the name of the bond, capital appreciation bond. Not only did you not have to pay any principal on the bond, you didn't have to pay any interest on the bond for 47 years. The interest kept accumulating and folding into the principal, so that at the end of the 47 years, and here you see, this is in the bond documents, here you see that that last one, for instance, that matures at 8/1 of 2054. The original amount that Puerto Rico borrowed was $97 million. At the maturity, the compounded amount was $1 billion. So you borrowed less than $100 million, but at the maturity of the bond, you were paying $1 billion for the money that you had borrowed. This is a payday loan for governments. It's a pure usury that was occurring. Every one of the firms that underwrote these bonds knew that Puerto Rico was not going to be able to pay the bond. Every one of the government officials in Puerto Rico who borrowed the money knew that there was no way that these bonds were going to be paid off. But they all figured it's a 47-year bond. We're going to be long gone before people realize the mess. The bankers are all going to be retired or in the grave. The politicians are all going to be retired or in the grave. So what did they care? What did they care? That they were involved in essentially a fraudulent operation. And there are many, many of these bonds. That's why so many people in Puerto Rico keep demanding a forensic analysis of the debt. Because if anyone who does a forensic analysis on the debt, just as people who did analysis of the subprime mortgage crisis, the debt, will realize there was massive fraud that was occurring in the contracting of this debt. So now we're in the situation where everyone's saying, well, Puerto Rico has to pay this money out. Let's go to court. Let's have a judge decide to what degree these were legal bonds that were issued. Now that this house of cards of predatory debt has come crumbling down, it must never be rebuilt and refashioned. There are some who will look at the temporary influx of federal money as a panacea after Maria, right? At least $45 billion now Congress has agreed to for rebuilding of Puerto Rico. But unless the structural changes are made, and I don't mean making the Puerto Rican people pay for predatory lending, any federal aid will just be band-aids. Here is a look at how the price of Puerto Rico bonds are doing on the financial markets right now. You'll notice that around December, which is the worst period right after the hurricane, if you wanted to buy Puerto Rico bonds, you got like 20 cents on the dollar, right? Now, there's been a little rally in the last few weeks to the bond market, so now you're up to about 40 cents on the dollar, which means that right now, the $74 billion are worth 40% of that on the market. The actual promesa board imposed by the government of the United States has already said there is no way that Puerto Rico can repay this debt, that the best that the bondholders can ever hope for is 25 cents on the dollar. Bondholders don't want to hear that. They do not want to hear that they've lost 3/4 of the money that's owed to them. So they're going to fight in court, and they're going to continue the battle. And but the rally in the bond prices is a result of the fact that Congress has now appropriated all this reconstruction money. And the bondholders are hoping they can grab that money, a portion of that money to pay their debts. So really what it is, they are speculating on how much of the federal aid they can grab to help pay off some of their bonds. And so that's going to be a continuing battle over the next few months. It's clear to me, and I think anybody who looks at the situation objectively, that Puerto Rico can't pay this debt. And when you can't pay a debt, you usually don't pay a debt. And the problem then becomes that this is such a massive debt that if all of these bondholders end up losing money, the entire municipal bond market of the United States will be tossed into upheaval. Because that means that no guarantee, remember this was in the Constitution of Puerto Rico, that the first thing that the government would pay was its debt. What happens to New York State's guarantee, or Colorado's guarantee to its bondholders, or Illinois, which is in really bad financial shape, its guarantees for its debts? Suddenly the entire government guarantee of debt will be called into question. And the price of borrowing for every municipality, every school system, every public authority in the United States will grow. If you were paying 2.5% interest on your bonds in Denver, if this crisis is not resolved, you may end up paying 4% interest, which means a whole lot more cost to your local governments. So there's going to be a ripple effect. The reason why Europe bailed out Greece is because if they didn't bail out Greece, the repercussions for all of Europe were going to be too menacing to contemplate. So I think that it's in the interest of the American people to understand that the debt crisis in Puerto Rico must be resolved either by the Federal Reserve doing what it did during the toxic mortgage crisis of assuming the debts until there could be a reasonable way of paying them off, or by the United States federal Congress itself directly interceding with a bailout, not of Puerto Rico, but of the U.S. municipal bond market, which is really what is what's at stake. So I think that in terms of solutions for the overall structural problem of Puerto Rico, the problem of Puerto Rico is that there's two nations involved. One nation is called the United States, the other nation is called Puerto Rico. Right? They're both under the same flag. Because the Americans never settled Puerto Rico like they did all the other territories of the Union, Puerto Rico developed its own language, history, and culture. Public schools are taught in Spanish. The courts are in Spanish, except when you get to the federal courts. And so the Puerto Ricans have a distinct national identity. And so therefore there has to be some solution that recognizes the separate nationhood of Puerto Rico and the sovereignty of Puerto Rico over its own affairs. While at the same time recognizing that most Puerto Ricans want to retain the U.S. citizenship that was given to them. That's been pretty clear now in most of the votes, in most of the referendums that have been held. So how do you fashion a solution where you don't have the colonial situation that you have now, but you have a more, a relationship of two sovereign entities to each other? That's the big question. You know, as I always say, it's easy to get married, it's hard to get divorced. It's easy to acquire a colony, it's hard to get rid of it. Because separation requires a settlement agreement between the two sides, and who's going to get what. Now that the United States Congress is no longer interested in keeping Puerto Rico, and can't figure out what to do with it. But now the crisis has forced the government to come up with solutions, not only to the reconstruction as a result of Maria, but to the longer-term structural problems of this colonial relationship must end. So I think that's the key question. And what to do in the meantime? The debt has to be canceled. The move to privatize the electrical utilities, which is moving really quickly. Understand the Puerto Rico Electric Utility is the largest publicly owned utility in the United States. It's publicly owned. It's a cash cow, and the private sector has wanted it for decades. So now they're moving to privatize it. But are they going to privatize it, replacing oil as the main form of electrical generation with natural gas, another fossil fuel? You know, or are they going to go to sustainable energy, wind, solar, completely for the island? Puerto Rico has to be exempted from the Jones Act, because that's clearly a sovereignty issue that is hurting Puerto Rico, the maritime laws. The U.S. government has to equalize Medicaid and Medicare funding and grant Puerto Rico earned income tax credits that the rest of the Americans have, but Puerto Rico does not. And in this country, Puerto Ricans and Americans of goodwill must not only lead a national outcry, they need to form safe Puerto Rico committees in every city to pressure Congress to assume the debt. And one last urging to Puerto Rican nationals in this country: buy land in Puerto Rico. Because there are so many empty houses and so much land that has defaulted and fallen into foreclosure that the predatory hedge funds are starting to buy up the land. And if Puerto Ricans don't invest in land trusts and in beginning to use their disposable funds to invest in the land, we may be seeing a total depopulation of the island in decades to come, and the creation of a new retirement community for Americans in Puerto Rico by hedge funds and other land speculators. So the island, the only way, the people who are most understand that is the Puerto Rican diaspora in the United States. When I was in the Young Lords, 1/3 of the Puerto Rican people lived in the United States. This is 1970, 71. 2/3 were on the island. Today, 5/8 of all the Puerto Rican people live in the United States. 5/8. So that trend is going to continue unless the Puerto Ricans of the diaspora decide, no, we have the ability not only to have political impact, but also economically to start investing our funds, whatever we have, in our homeland. Well, thank you very much. I'll leave with that.
I'll take the mic to them. So, any questions for Mr. Gonzalez?
All right, then. My name is Jeremy Martinez Quinones. My question is in relation to the Jones Act, and I guess I'm personally a graduate student here, getting my master's in property development and construction management, and I, kind of been assessing, the effects of the Jones Act on overall construction in Puerto Rico and the biggest impediment that it has to shipping from overseas into the island. And my question is, I guess, what sort of rally from your historical perspective have you seen to try to revoke the Jones Act? And from that rally, what sort of success was been able to be attained? And also what is your foresight for the Jones Act and how that'll affect the construction overall?
Well, I think that there's probably more chance of finally getting Puerto Rico out from under the Jones Act today than there has ever been. But I don't know if people are familiar. Most people are familiar with the Jones Act and what it does. The Jones Act, basically, it's a maritime shipping law. It had good intention when it was passed in the 1920s to protect the ability of the United States to have its own merchant marine in case of war, so that U.S. commercial ships could be nationalized in case of war to move transport and supplies. So it requires that any goods move from one U.S. port to another U.S. port must be on a U.S. built ship, a U.S. flagged ship, and a U.S. crew manned ship. All three things. The boat must be built in the United States, the boat must be registered as an American ship, and the crew must be American. Now, the entire world transports its shipping on ships that are built in South Korea and Taiwan, some in Japan, that have a Panamanian or Liberian flag. They're flagged, registered in Panama or Liberia, and that are manned by Greek, Cypriot, and other Southern European crews. That's how the world travels. It's the cheapest form that the shipping industry has devised to ship goods. Yet in the United States, everything coming in and out of Puerto Rico, because 90% of our goods come from the United States, is on an American-built ship, an American flag ship, an American manned ship. The result is the shipping costs of everything to Puerto Rico are far higher. And its estimates, I think, are 25 to 30% increase in the prices of everything in Puerto Rico, whether it's cars, anything that comes in and out of Puerto Rico. The cost of the shipping escalates the prices. There are some estimates that as much as $500 million, it has about $500 million a year in cost and it's not just Puerto Rico. Alaska has the same problem, Hawaii has the same problem, and the Virgin Islands did have the problem, but the Virgin Islands were exempted decades ago from the Jones Act. And because Puerto Rico is far larger than Hawaii or Alaska in population and the size of its economy, the cost of the Jones Act is astronomical to Puerto Rico. The problem is that Puerto Rico represents about 25% of the entire merchant marine traffic of the United States because of that. It's a captive market, which means that the maritime unions want to preserve the Jones Act, which means that the AFL-CIO, following the bid of the maritime unions, is always opposed to eliminating the Jones Act for Puerto Rico, because it's a job creator. for the maritime fleet of the United States. So you have a problem that the labor movement is blocking. And many Democrats then don't want to vote in opposition to the labor movement to eliminate the Jones Act. You have more Republican votes to eliminate the Jones Act because they hate unions anyway, and they see this as an opportunity to get rid of some more unionization. But the reality is that from the point of view of the interests of the Puerto Rican people, the Jones Act has to be either eliminated or Puerto Rico has to be exempted from it, as the Virgin Islands have been for years. So that's a battle that has to continue to be fought and can be won, I believe. But people have to understand that this is a monopoly that is driving up prices for a country where 50% or 45 to 50% of the people living in poverty anyway. So it's crazy to maintain the Jones Act. And I think that there's greater opportunity, and that's one thing that you can all do to all of your congressmen and your senators, is say get rid of the Jones Act for Puerto Rico. That will definitely lower prices of everything in Puerto Rico overnight.
I'm Kathy, and I've heard that the charter schools are now bailing out the poor school systems that are falling apart in Puerto Rico because so many people move to the mainland, they don't have the kids, but on the other hand, of course, Maria knocked them out. My fear is that the charter schools in Puerto Rico may become a guinea pig test case, if you will, for charter schools elsewhere. What are your thoughts?
Well, this is one of the disaster capitalism shock doctrine things that is now being implemented. The Secretary of Education in Puerto Rico now is an American, right, who was brought in. And she is, who was brought from the mainland, and she is definitely wants to move forward, as does the current governor, with basically dismantling the public school system. They've already closed, I think last September, about 185 schools. They have plans to close many more. Now,
last Monday, they closed 238 public schools, and they're already starting to
238 more on Monday. Right, and now there is a reality that the school-age population of Puerto Rico has declined dramatically because so many people have left. So there are some schools that needed to be closed, but the problem with Puerto Rico is that the local community schools have always been such an integral part of every township and remote area in Puerto Rico that you just can't use your normal calculus of a bean counter to say, well, there's only 100 kids or 80 kids in this school, so this school is not efficient, close it, move them somewhere else. It's not that easy in Puerto Rico. But I think that they're going to try to do in Puerto Rico what they did in New Orleans. The entire public school system of New Orleans was changed to charters. Immediately after Katrina, the people weren't demanding a charter school system. It was imposed on them in the aftermath of the hurricane. And so I think this is this shock doctrine, disaster capitalism that Naomi Klein talks about. They're going to use the hurricane and the disaster to basically impose things that normally would not be accepted by the public. But people are so tired and worn out. I was talking last night with one of our speakers here from Puerto Rico, and she's talking about the emotional drain on people of 4 months without electricity. You know, there's a famous line from the great radical journalist John Reed in his book, 10 Days That Shook the World, his first-hand account of the Russian Revolution. John Reed writes in his book, in the 10 days of the Russian Revolution, the Russian people aged 10 years. That sometimes these cataclysmic events actually age a population. And I believe that in Puerto Rico, in the last 4 months, the Puerto Rican people have aged years in the suffering that they've had to withstand, the assault from so many different ways on their economy, on their schools, on everything else, that people are tired, they're like exhausted. And so they are easy prey now to be attacked with slick new schemes of how to better things. And this is happening in schools. We're going to remake the school system, and we're going to bring in more of a private model, a charter model. When the reality was not that the public schools of Puerto Rico were in such bad shape. It's just that the financial crisis of the government has resulted in so much disinvestment into them.
Hello, Mr. Gonzalez. Thank you for coming here and having this very important conversation. My name is Aaron Hines. I'm a senior here at DU and also of Puerto Rican descent. So, like I said, just want to reiterate you for having this conversation. And you bring up a lot of good points, just because, you know, with recent referendums, we've seen that a lot of Puerto Ricans would like to keep their U.S. citizenship instead of trying to figure out something else to do. But what I also researched was that even in 2017, with the recent referendum, there was only 23% of the voter base that actually came out to vote in favor of statehood. And then on top of that, as you've mentioned before, a lot of our decision making in regards to our political status as a colony is limited, just because Congress does have the final say in the future of Puerto Rico. So my question, and then another thing that I was looking into was that even if Puerto Rico was to become a state, what I would hate would be for our culture and our language and our history to be commercialized into a commodity, much the same way that Hawaii, unfortunately, experienced when it became a state due to American imperialism. So with that being said, my question is really about what do you see what do you see would maximize the future of Puerto Rico? Do you believe that statehood or trying to work within the colonial status would be the best option for Puerto Rico, or do you think that the diaspora and especially the people living on the island as of now, do you think that some form of independence, whether it's more autonomy in order to control our economy, or outright independence, which do you believe would be the best option for forward?
Well, you raised a very important question, and which is underlying, you know, the long-term solution to all of these problems. Is I was always, for many years, a supporter of independence for Puerto Rico, and I understood that the federal government had systematically repressed the independence movement for so many decades, jailed so many of its leaders, that it really became. You had to be especially brave in Puerto Rico to be a supporter of independence throughout the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. However, there have been a series of referendums over those years that demonstrate that the outright independence still receives about 5% of the vote in all of these referendums. So I think that the Puerto Rican people are not ignorant. They've been sending a message now for decades, whether they voted for Commonwealth or they voted for statehood, that they believe that even though U.S. citizenship was imposed on them by the Congress, the reality is that the United States, as the world's greatest imperial power, when you are a citizen of the United States, you have like a Trump citizenship in the world. You know, it is, so I believe that they pretty much sent the signal that they want to keep their citizenship. However, Puerto Rico remains a separate nation. And I don't believe that Puerto Rico will ever become a state of the United States. Maybe 30 years or 40 years from now, they'll get a real majority, not this fake one of the last referendum, a real majority to support statehood. But you need two to agree. The Congress has to agree. Hawaii voted for statehood repeatedly for decades. It didn't only became a state in 1960 or 59. It became a state in 1959. But by that time, Anglo-Americans were like a plurality of the state of the territory, of the Hawaiian territory. They were a large population. The Anglo-American never settled Puerto Rico. To this day, 90 to 95% of the population of Puerto Rico is Puerto Rican and a small percentage Dominican, but there's only a tiny percentage of Anglo-Americans. So the territory was never settled, therefore it was never integrated culturally into the rest of the country, therefore it developed its own identity and culture. So, and Congress, before Congress would have to admit Puerto Rico into the Union, would have to admit the District of Columbia too, because the District of Columbia has been calling for statehood far longer. And the last thing that the Republicans in Congress want to do is to admit a largely African-American state and a largely Latino state. And in Puerto Rico's case, it has a population greater than 22 states. So it would be a significant congressional delegation that would fundamentally shift the balance of power in the Congress. So Congress knows that. So they're not going to admit Puerto Rico as a state. And they've also said repeatedly, because I've been in many of the hearings on status in the Senate and the House, that if Puerto Rico wants to become a state, it must change the language of instruction in its schools to English. They will not admit a state that teaches their kids in a different language as a primary language. That they have to change the language of the courts to English. So basically, they will demand cultural suicide by the Puerto Rican people as the price of even considering statehood. So I don't believe that statehood will ever occur to Puerto Rico. So now what do? The current model is no longer viable. Independence, most Puerto Ricans believe that to be completely independent of the United States will leave them adrift economically, and they want to keep their citizenship, and statehood is not viable. There is a solution, recognized by the United Nations as a process of decolonization. The UN recognizes 3 forms of decolonization: complete independence from the colonial master, integration, annexation into the existing nation, or free association. Free association is a status where both sides recognize that the other is a sovereign nation, and that they enter into an ongoing political pact. The United States has one of these. It's called the Commonwealth of the Northern Marianas. That is a commonwealth, a sovereign entity that has entered into a pact with the United States, whereby the United States provides mutual national defense, the same monetary union, the dollar, but that Puerto Rico would be represented in the United Nations, would be able to enact its own economic treaties, would basically be a separate sovereign nation in a union, voluntary union between both sides, which could have a 25 or 30 or 50-year renewal date, whereby you would recognize the citizenship of each other. Puerto Rico would recognize the citizenship of Americans who move to Puerto Rico. Americans would recognize the citizenship of Puerto Ricans who move to the United States. So it's an accepted way of decolonizing in international law. Free association in one of the last referendums got about 24% of the vote. So it's growing as a potential, and I think it's the only viable solution to the long-term problem. But it's not yet sort of in the consciousness of most people, either in the United States or in Puerto Rico.
I'm going to go in Spanish and English because it's easier for my brain. Buenos días, mi nombre es Patti Rosado, yo soy de Puerto Rico, llevo en Denver ya 2 años, pero en junio yo regreso a la isla. My question for Mr. Gonzalez is not really a question, it's just like something for the general audience to ponder upon. I myself am an advocate for independence of Puerto Rico. One of the reasons I'm going back is to fight for that and become more politically involved in different solidarity actions that are happening in the island, especially in the mountainous regions where you see a form of socialism, anarchism, and communism coming together to respond to the issues of Maria. As I speak to people and my comrades on the island and in Denver, one of the things that we start to think about and consider a lot is how do we decolonize the Puerto Rican mindset. For 200 years we have been told that we don't have the self-sufficiency to rule ourselves, that we don't have the ability to become an independent country via, it would be from the Spaniards' colonial rules or the American rules, and they did this a lot in the 20s and the 30s with their propaganda towards the island and what they try to educate us upon in our mindset. So, as a Puerto Rican, who is going to give up her life fighting for my country? How do we work together to decolonize our minds first? Because in order to achieve that dream of independence, we have to convince the majority of Puerto Ricans that we do have the ability to become a sovereign nation, that we have nations that want to show their solidarity to us. We have Venezuela, we have Cuba, we have Uruguay, we have the Central Americas. They're all saying, we can do this. We have a union. come join us. So how, as the diaspora and this more elite academic people that are in this room, because we know that this is not the general population of Puerto Rico. You know, when you go to Puerto Rico, this is not the discussion you're going to find on the streets, en el colmado, o en el barrio, en el, tú sabes, tú no vas a ver esto en las calles de Puerto Rico. Esto se ve en la universidad o outside of Puerto Rico. So how do we get this discussion into the Puerto Rican mindset, into the local Puerto Rican who is struggling right now, like my family, who's right now in so much pain and suffering after the hurricane? How do we get them to think about, hey, we can actually self-empower ourselves and move beyond those three solutions that we had at an international level to a more dramatic and radical solution that I think is what we need? Because under the Imperial United States, they're not going to give us either of the three solutions that we have, because we give so much more to the United States than what we receive from them. Okay, that's it. Thank you.
I'm Maldonado, and I'm the director of Barrio A. We foster Latino culture in here, and we have an ensemble that actually performs Puerto Rican music, Puerto Rican bomba in Colorado. And I would like to know, I believe that there were key in the survival piece when the hurricane came, and I believe it was self-managed organizations and diaspora. Can you tell us, from your point of view, what should be our goals to really move forward from this crisis on both the organizaciones de autogestión, self-managed organizations, and diaspora?
Yeah, well, I agree with you that those were the two bright spots, because the local Puerto Rican government as well as the federal government were a total disaster in responding to the crisis. And there's great hope in all of the grassroots organizations that mobilized of their own in their local communities to try to begin to deal with the fact that they were abandoned, that nobody was dealing with the problems that they were facing. So I think it's really important to build up those grassroots organizations. When people ask me all the time, well, if I want to give money or if I want to help here in the United States, what do I do? I tell them, don't give to all these big national organizations, the Red Cross or even the Hispanic Federation, which is, the Hispanic Federation has gotten a lot of fundraising as a result of the Puerto Rico crisis, because Lin-Manuel Miranda, who's a fabulous artist, has been urging people to give money to the Hispanic Federation. And unfortunately, most people don't know that the Hispanic Federation was founded by Lin-Manuel's father, Luis Miranda, so he's built up that national forum. But a lot of that money doesn't necessarily get to the grassroots, these big national organizations. You have to be able to identify groups like Casa Pueblo, like others that are actually doing the work at the grassroots level, so that if you give money and you give support, it goes to those people who are actually organizing self-sufficient approaches, whether it's solar power microgrids or whether it's their own rebuilding of destroyed homes, and not to give to these organizations that take a huge percentage off the top just for their own operation, and then leave a lot less that gets down to the people who are doing the actual work. So it's important to begin to be able to discriminate between which organizations are actually effective on the ground. And I do think that the diaspora here has an enormous role to play, because Puerto Rico has no voting representation in Congress. The actual voting representation of Puerto Rico is Nidia Velázquez from New York, and Luis Gutierrez from Chicago, and Jose Serrano, and now there's a new Puerto Rican congressman in Central Florida, and there is another Puerto Rican congressman in Idaho, Labrador, who's lost. He makes Ted Cruz look like a liberal, Raul Labrador. But I think that aside from Labrador, all the others are the ones that are really carrying the efforts of of the Puerto Rican population to force the Congress to deal with the situation in Puerto Rico. But you can play a role in wherever you are in terms of influencing your Congress, specifically about the aid to Puerto Rico, about assuming the debt, and about exempting the Jones Act. Those are, I think, the three things that are most important at this time to be able to alleviate the suffering. That's not going to solve the long-term problem of the structural problems of Puerto Rico, but it alleviates the immediate suffering of the people to be able to then tackle the longer-term issue of resolving the status question. And again, in terms of what you said, I completely agree with you. You need to continue to build those organizations and especially return agriculture to Puerto Rico. It's crazy that most of Puerto Rico's food is imported when it's such a fertile land and that most of the land is going to waste. So that has to change. My point about the independence, the problems of independence, is that independence has proven not to be the solution that many folks thought after World War II, because so many countries continue to be under the heel of imperialism while they are nominally independent. and so that they are independent but still controlled. And they are increasingly controlled by the forces of global capitalism. So it's not the solution to the problem. It's a step, but it's not the solution to the problem. So that's why I think we have to think deeper about how do you build sovereignty in this increasingly interdependent world.
Thanks so much. And thanks to everyone for the questions. A round of applause for Juan Gonzalez.